This is Electric Universe Eyes, and today I'm going to narrate from the Thunderbolts Project Picture of the Day, titled Notes on an Incipient Cosmos, Part 3, written by Mel Atchison, posted August 24th, 2015. Quote, really and truly. Thinking is done with nerves and words. Nerves don't transmit information. The discharge of one nerve stimulates another to discharge. Discharges of many nerves are linked and sorted into patterns of activation, and the patterns are rendered into words and arranged into narratives or models. Somewhere during the rendering and the arranging, meaning and understanding and thinking arise. Between the sensory reactivity of nerves and the modeling that makes sense of the reactivity lies a creative act of putting it into words. Language adds abstraction, generality, and viewpoint. It adds the virtual subject at the center of viewpoint and the lexical object that is viewed. Not every rendering is meaningful. Not every arrangement is understandable. Not every model makes sense. But the truth of a model is a lexical judgment about it. Had Shakespeare made Hamlet a philosopher of science instead of a prince, Hamlet might have declared, quote, "There is nothing either true or false, but thinking makes it so," end quote. This doesn't mean that truth is whimsical, but that it's a matter of thoughtfulness. In this regard, it's useful to distinguish at least two of the many ways the word truth is used. Herman Weyl remarked over half a century ago, quote, "What is immediately experienced is subjective and absolute. The objective world is relative." This pair of opposites, subjective, absolute, and objective, relative, seems to me to contain one of the most profound epistemological truths which can be gathered from the study of nature. A plaque on the wall of a local medical laboratory puts it in simpler terms. Quote, "It's easier to take measurements than to know what you're measuring," end quote. That nerves are activated is undeniable, but the meaning is ambiguous. Interpreting the activations with respect to other activations that are called theories, especially if one's colleagues agree with the interpretation, converts them into meaningful objective facts, but only because of their relationship to the theories. That is to say, relative to the theories. Subjective truth, then, is absolute in its existence, but ambiguous in meaning. Objective truth is, or can be made, absolute in its meaning, but it necessarily will be related to a set of general statements whose application to any particular situation is a matter to be decided. Another way to think of this is that theories populate the objective world with, quote, things. A meter needle points to 5. In terms of nerves, this is an activation, already extensively processed and interpreted, that results in saying, the meter needle points to 5. Call these kinds of activations, quote, data. Further processing and activation, although they may not be subsequent in time, result in saying, the potential difference across this resistor is 5 volts. Call these kinds of activations, quote, facts. Quote, things appear between the data and the facts, and those things are supplied by the general statement of a theory. Data tells us that, quote, it is. Theory tells us what, quote, it is. How to interpret, what words to use. Is an ion a particle with momentum or a current carrier in a circuit? An astronomer with the theory of mechanics will see ions impacting on the surface of Io. A plasma physicist with a theory of Bennett pinches will see a plasma-focused discharge. Is a star a speck of gravitationally compacted matter isolated in the midst of emptiness? Or is it an enormous plasma sheath interacting with interstellar plasma, and the higher density speck of optically radiating matter at the center is an unimportant residue? Or is it something not yet imagined for lack of theories and facts? If facts are particular interpretations of data with respect to some theory, which theory is a collection of general statements, then a model is the narrative that combines facts and theory. A model conciliates facts and theories into a coherent whole in which statements deduced from theory correspond to statements interpreted from data. Stephen Toulmin wrote of, quote, the continual interaction of theory with fact, the way in which theories are built on facts, while at the same time giving significance to them and even determining what are, quote, facts for us at all. The things of reality are profoundly words. I write profoundly to counter the common disparagement of language as superficial. An appeal to make things, quote, more real, more absolute, collapses on the futility of trying to talk about them without talking. The ineffable reverts to the ambiguity of the subject absolute. The meter reading will not give you, quote, volts. Comments about truth and objectivity usually bring up reality as well, so it may be useful to comment on that. Poet Wallace Stevens mirrored Whale's epistemic opposites when he distinguished between a Platonic reality and a poetic one. In the former, we, quote, draw ourselves away from the unsubstantial, fluctuating facts of the world about us and establish some communion with the objects, which are apprehended by thought and nonsense, end quote. In the latter, reality, quote, impinges upon us from outside, the sense that we can touch and feel a solid reality, which does not wholly dissolve itself into the conceptions of our own minds. It is the individual in particular that does this, end quote. He echoes the previous comments about things. Quote, there is in reality an aspect of individuality at which every form of rational explanation stops short. Reality is not the thing but the aspect of the thing, end quote. Rational explanation is what turns aspects into things, at the expense of leaving, quote, a solid reality behind. The tension between these two realities appear as contradiction when the two are not distinguished, as when someone asserts that the things of a model are, quote, really out there, apart from cognitive operations. The out there is itself a cognitive framework for organizing and understanding sensory stimuli. The objective world is not something alien to human thought, but is constructed by thought for the purpose of thought. Thought draws a line in the sensory sand that enables one to divide sensations into me and not me. It's useful to consider things in relation to other things, such as the ball reflects 700 nanometers wavelength light, instead of in relation to the observer, the ball is red. The claim for a non-cognitive, quote, really out there attempts to imbue the, quote, objects which are apprehended by thought, end quote, with the absolute there-ness that, quote, impinges upon us. The consequence is to reify abstractions and to mystify appearances. The two realities cannot be reconciled. The claim that scientific theories, quote, approach reality nullifies itself upon realizing that an approachable reality is necessarily a hypothetical one. If our knowledge is approaching reality, then we have no knowledge of reality. Our compass tells us only where we've been. Our rod tells us only how far we've come. They provide not a clue about where we're going. Furthermore, historical studies have undermined the claim for conceptual continuity of theories, which would be necessary for an approach. A case can be made for instrumental and technological continuity in science, but the theories and models are discrete and incommensurable. The objects of our thought pass through the appearances that impinge on us like wisps of fog through a forest. Refusing to conflate the insubstantial certainties of thought with the substantial elusiveness of appearances requires us to give up the presumption of a singular reality, at least insofar as we can talk about it in any scientific sense. We can then appreciate the truthfulness of the discarded theories of past times. We can anticipate the demise of currently accepted theories, and we can understand why scientific revolutions are inevitable. This incommensurability, noted most famously by Thomas Kuhn in his 1962 essay, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, means that changing a model will change the things that populate the objective world. Quote, led by a new paradigm, scientists adopt new instruments and look in new places. Even more important, during revolutions, scientists see new and different things when looking with familiar instruments in places they have looked before, end quote. Quote, the proponents of competing paradigms practice their trades in different worlds. They see different things when they look from the same point in the same direction, end quote. Between the looking and the seeing lies the land of imagination. This is the birthplace of both models and fantasies. Distinguishing between the things of science and the things of science fiction is beyond the scope of this essay, but the reader should be aware that, quote, science for the adherents of one model will appear to be, quote, science fiction for the adherents of another model. They may be looking at the same data, but they see different realities, different facts, different things. The act of creativity, the place of imagination, between reactivity and making sense of reactivity, is a kind of cognitive artistry, attributed to poets from which the word poetry derives. The Greek poiein, to make or to create. Wallace Stevens wrote disapprovingly of, quote, the extraction of a meaning from a poem and appraisement of it by rational standards of truth, end quote. One could write equally disapprovingly of the extraction of ingenuity from a theory and the denial of its imaginative wellsprings by rational standards of truth. With caution against extending the metaphor too far, it makes a certain amount of sense to think of science as conceptual art, brushing measurements onto an imaginative canvas to create a truthful model. Less poetically, Stephen Toulmin comments, quote, science progresses not by recognizing the truth of new observations alone, but by making sense of them, end quote. There can be more than one making, and, as I will describe next, the makings will compete for acceptance. This was written by Mel Atchison. For more information, please visit thunderbolts.info.